It's 416 BCE. The mighty Athenians have arrived at Melos, a tiny island in the Aegean Sea. Frustrated with a series of misfortunes during the war, the Athenians besieged the city to let off some steam on the island, which had resisted previous Athenian attempts at subjugation. After bullying the Melians into submission, the Athenians unleashed a level of violence unprecedented in Greek history, murdering every male in Melos and enslaving the remaining women and children. The legendary historian Thucydides records the Athenian reply to the Melians justifying the atrocity in what is now famously known as the Melian Dialogue. "We shall not trouble you with specious pretenses. You know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." This was the bleak attitude that plagued the legendary Peloponnesian War, fought from 431 to 404 BCE, between the two superpowers of the ancient Greek world. Sparta, the stronghold of oligarchy, premier land power, and the leader of the Peloponnesian League, waged war against the Athenians, founders of democracy, masters of the Aegean Sea, and the rulers of a newly minted Athenian empire. The siege of Melos was one of many destructive episodes in a devastating war that challenged the very foundations of Greek codes of honor and instilled a bleaker picture of humanity that only war can teach. Why did this war happen? How could the Greek world, which was brilliantly united against their Persian invaders only half a century ago, suddenly break out into a Greek world war, friend against friend, father against son? Stay tuned as we uncover the epic tale of antiquity's most famous war. To understand the causes of the war, we need to glean clues from the state of the Greek international system in the 5th century BCE. A great rivalry dictated the international landscape of the ancient Greek world. Sparta was a traditional power in the region, and its unique social structure, configured by the semi-legendary Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus, prioritized military productivity above all else. Like many of its contemporaries, the Spartan state consisted of rulers and ruled, in which an elite class of Spartiates, citizens with full rights, focused exclusively on military training, while a class of slaves, helots, and free non-Spartan locals, periokoi, provided the labor and trade to fund the Spartans' military lifestyle. This social dynamic helped Sparta produce the preeminent military land force, whose martial successes during the Greco-Persian Wars cemented Sparta's reputation among the Greeks as an established regional hegemon. Its foreign policy was preoccupied with a few traditional concerns. First, the Spartans always feared Helot rebellions and endeavored to keep an iron grip firmly around Helot throats. This created an ironic circumstance in which Sparta was always prepared for war, but rarely willing to go to it out of fear that their military preoccupation might give the Helots opportunities to foment rebellion at home. Compounding the problem was Argos, a powerful democratic state northeast Sparta. An attack from either the Helots or the Argive would encourage the other party to do the same. Alliances were therefore imperative, and Sparta developed pacts across the Peloponnese with various members ranging from easily controllable microstates like Phlius to powerful military collaborators like Thebes and Corinth. By the 5th century BCE, Sparta found itself at the helm of the mighty Peloponnesian League and the owner of the premier Greek land force. On all accounts, Sparta's position was stable and secure, but a looming threat was quickly rising in the east. A maritime empire was rising, and Athens was leading it. Originally an obscure town in Attica, Athens had leveraged the success and leadership of its superior navy against the Persians towards building an alliance with coastal cities and islands across the Aegean Sea, eager for naval protection, commercial benefits, and the promising Athenian democratic experiment. Eventually, this loose alliance, traditionally called the Delian League, morphed into an Athenian empire, helmed by the premier navy in the Greek world. Athens had quickly moved from a burgeoning leader among equals to a rich ruler of subordinates. The international picture was clear to all Greeks. A rising challenger was on course to butt heads with Sparta for hegemony of the Greek world. War was looming. It was Thucydides who first observed Sparta and Athens were on a superpower collision course. To him, the cause of the war was the one which was formerly most kept out of sight, the growth of the power of Athens, and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon made war inevitable. But the Greek states were careful and conservative entities, and wars were rarely desirable. As is often the case in history, the war needed a spark to light the dynamite. In 436, a civil war erupted in a small city called Epidamnus, deep north in the Ionian Gulf, between democratic and aristocratic factions. Under siege, the Democrats reached out to Corinth, a powerful Greek state allied to Sparta, for support against the aristocratic party. Corinth saw an opportunity to build a strategic presence near its estranged colony Corcyra, and accepted Epidamnus' offer, dispatching a garrison to the city. Furious that the Corinthians would encroach upon Corcyra's sphere of influence, the Corcyrians gave the small city an ultimatum: reject the garrison, or face the might of Corcyra's powerful navy. But the city refused. Worse, Corinth responded with reinforcements and beckoned Greeks from all over the Peloponnesian League to form a new Corinthian colony in Epidamnus. Surprisingly, the spiteful Corinthians were escalating the conflict to a level of provocation that Corcyra could not ignore, and in a quick battle at Luceme in 435 BCE, the Corcyrians crushed the Corinthian fleet, along with any further Corinthian aggression. Or so they hoped. Rather than capitulate and retreat from Epidamnus, a region that ultimately offered little strategic value, Corinth vowed for revenge and spent the following 2 years building up a powerful fleet to rival Corcyra's. With the Corinthian threat growing, Corcyra had to look eastward. An alliance with Athens was now on the table, and a small skirmish in a city far away was suddenly spiraling into a threat to the Greek balance of power. In September of 433, the Athenian assembly gathered round the Nix to hear the petitions of both cities. First, they challenged Corcyra to explain why the Athenians should involve themselves in a faraway conflict for a small state with no history of friendship with Athens. The Corcyrians came duly prepared. Beyond appeals to moral justice, they made a Corcyrian-Athenian alliance a matter of existential necessity. They appealed to fear. If any of you imagine that war is far off, he is grievously mistaken, and is blind to the fact that Lacedaemon regards you with jealousy and desires war, and that Corinth is powerful there. The same, remember, that is your enemy, and is even now trying to subdue us as a preliminary to attacking you. Worse, if the Athenians failed to protect Corcyra, Athenian naval domination would be critically threatened by a Corinthian navy strengthened with captured Corcyrian ships. Remember that there are but 3 considerable naval powers in Hellas: Athens, Corcyra, and Corinth, and that if you allow 2 of these 3 to become one, and Corinth to secure us for herself, you will have to hold the sea against the united fleets of Corcyra and the Peloponnese. But if you receive us, you will have our ships to reinforce you in the struggle. Corcyra's argument made danger palpable to the assembly, and Corinth had a difficult case to make. They initially argued that a Corcyrian alliance was against the peaceful spirit of the 30-year peace signed earlier by Athens and Sparta, which sought to maintain the balance of power. They then brushed away Corcyra's fear-mongering and reassured the Athenians that peace would remain should Athens reject Corcyra's petition. But if Athens should form an alliance with Corcyra, Corinth would have no choice. You cannot become their auxiliary and remain our friend. If you join in their attack, you must share the punishment which the defenders inflict on them. Their threat was clear. Corinth would include Athens in its revenge against Corcyra. After days of debate, the Athenians emerged with a decision. Departing from typical Greek offensive alliances, Athens proclaimed a defensive pact with Corcyra. It was a radically new policy, likely authored by the pioneering Pericles, the great leader of Athens. While Thucydides claims the Athenians' rationale was that war was inevitable, the defensive nature of the alliance suggests that Athens was actually concerned with deterring war. To Pericles and his supporters, it was an acceptable compromise that sought to avoid both the loss of the Corcyraean navy to their enemies and an offensive alliance that would likely embroil them in a war with Sparta. This Periclean policy of minimal deterrence was a first in the Greek world and would characterize Athenian strategy in the first phase of the war. But Corinth interpreted the gesture as an unacceptable provocation and left for Sparta, now determined to drag the Peloponnesian League into their scheme for revenge. The Athenian strategy of deterrence ironically triggered an escalation of the conflict. In Sparta, Corinth led a passionate damnation of Athens and called on Sparta to honor its allies. Sparta had been too timid and reserved in its policy towards the events unfolding around the Greek world. They were dangerously underestimating Athens. The Corinthian petition came at a particularly auspicious moment. It wasn't Corinth's damning indictment that moved Sparta to war. It was a growing anxiety within the Spartan assembly that they had let Athens grow too strong. The Corinthians merely woke the Spartans from a stupor of timidity and provided them with an opportunity to act preemptively against their rival. The aggressive effort, Sthenelatus, captured the martial energy that took over the Spartan assembly that day. Vote therefore, Lacedaemonians, for war, as the honor of Sparta demands, and neither allow the further aggrandizement of Athens, nor betray our allies to ruin, but with the gods, let us advance against the aggressors. They voted that Athens had broken the treaty of the 30-year peace, and that Sparta had to respond. Sparta was going to war. Around 432 BCE, the Athenians received an ultimatum from Sparta, demanding Athens dissolve its empire or face war with the Peloponnesian League. Lacedaemon wishes the peace to continue, and there is no reason why it should not, if he would leave the Hellenes independent. The Athenian assembly could not entertain that idea. But an offensive war with Sparta was also dangerous. To address this uncomfortable dilemma, Pericles once again resorted to an unorthodox policy of moderation. Rather than meet the Spartan land force on the field, the Athenians would wage a defensive war. Their construction of the long walls, which connected Athens to its naval base at Piraeus, would ensure Athens had access to its navy. In turn, they could leverage their massive treasury and vast trade networks across the Aegean to meet the various needs of the city. The Spartans could ravage the Athenian countryside, but so long as the Athenians turtled within their walls and kept their naval networks afloat, Athens would remain virtually unharmed. Pericles hoped his strategy would soon make Sparta realize that destroying Athens was impossible, and that war was pointless. Led by King Archidamus, the Spartans adopted an offensive strategy. Their superior armies would ravage Attica, a major source of Athens' economic output, and try to provoke decisive battles with Athens' land forces. While the Athenians aimed to resume the status quo, the Spartans wanted nothing less than the dissolution of the Athenian Empire. The Spartan alliance included powerhouses across the Peloponnese, including the Megarians and Locrians to its north, the Boeotians near central Greece, Corinth and many of its colonies, and Syracuse and the Dorians in Sicily. Its ultimate weapon was its world-class hoplite army of Peloponnesians and Boeotians, a near-invincible force 3 times the size of the Athenian hoplite phalanx, and whose ability to win battles was key to the Spartan strategy. While Athens had a smaller, less capable army, the heart of their war effort was at sea. Their combined fleet was 3 to 4 times the size of Sparta's, totaled over 300 Athenian warships and over 100 from their allies, and was manned by the best rowers in the world. With both strategies formulated, the two superpowers set the stage for the first phase of a long and bloody conflict. The Peloponnesian War had started. Months after the declaration of war, the fighting finally began in March 431 in Boeotia, when Thebes, a powerful Spartan ally, carried out a plot to capture the strategic Boeotian town of Plataea, an old ally of Athens that had resisted Thebes' previous attempts to incorporate it into the Boeotian League. In Athens' hands, Plataea served as a dangerous threat to Thebes for a few reasons. It was only 8 miles away from the city and could be used as a base to launch attacks into Thebes and its Boeotian allies. Plataea also flanked the only road from Thebes to Athens. Under Athenian control, Plataea could help rout any Theban army attempting to enter Attica. Thebes saw an opportunity to gain a sneaky strategic victory. In the cover of night in March 431, the Thebans snuck into Plataea with the help of the town's traitorous oligarchic faction and began a surprise attack. But things quickly got sour. The Thebans were in an unfamiliar town, covered in darkness, and the Plataeans exploited their home advantage. They quickly captured the Thebans in an embarrassingly short scuffle, and proceeded to murder the Theban prisoners in a frenzied revenge. The atrocity horrified the Greeks, who were used to an etiquette of war that valued honorable conduct and mercy to prisoners. The first act in the war was a bitter failure and a sign of the atrocities to come. After hearing of the Theban failure, King Archidamus organized a grand army of Spartans and allies and marched to the Isthmus of Corinth. It was time to invade Athenian territory. The Peloponnesian army ravaged the plains of Attica, cutting down valuable crops, vines, and olive trees. Pushed by a furious Athenian assembly to respond more aggressively, Pericles ordered various naval attacks around Epidaurus, Hermione, and Methone, and secured alliances with Thrace and Macedonia in the north to put pressure on Potidaea, a loyal colony of Corinth that Athens had besieged. But these responses were irritating to the Spartans more than anything. While Sparta was devastating Attica, Athens was waging a costly siege in Potidaea and an ineffective naval campaign. Pericles' policy had admittedly failed to achieve its goal to either prevent the war or minimize the damage to Athenian capabilities. To complicate matters, a deadly plague ravaged Athens from 430 to 427, killing thousands of hoplites and around a third of Athens' overall population. The first few years of the war were going badly, and morale was low. Pericles had to answer for his unorthodox strategy. But Pericles would never live to see the war through. In September 429, just a few years into the war, he would die of a protracted illness. While his failing policy had hurt Athenian confidence in their great leader, the Athenians never gave up on the legendary statesman, a man who led Athens through its worst days and its best. His death created a political void in Athens that was filled by two competing leaders, the pious Nicias, son of Niceratus, and the bellicose politician Cleon. Albeit to different degrees, both sought a departure from Pericles' strategy towards a more aggressive offense. Athens needed new leaders for a new strategy. In 425, an opportunity at Sphacteria near Pylos allowed the Athenians to try their new offensive strategies under the leadership of a brilliant general named Demosthenes. After the Spartans attacked the Athenian post at Pylos due to rumors that it was harboring Helot runaways, Demosthenes quickly took advantage with his navy, outmaneuvering the Spartans and trapping them on a nearby island called Sphacteria. After holding out for weeks, the Spartans shockingly surrendered. It was a great victory for the Athenians, and they quickly used their Spartan hostages to gain insurance that Sparta never enter Attica again. The affair damaged Spartan pride and effectively halted Spartan initiatives in Attica. The momentum, even if briefly, had shifted in Athens' favor, and their new aggressive policy seemed to be working. But war is capricious, and the tides soon again turned against Athens. In August of 424, Sparta's most distinguished general, Brasidas, son of Tellus, marched his army towards Thrace and forced the surrender of the city of Amphipolis, a critical source of materials like timber, gold, and silver, and a major contributor to Athens' depleting war fund. The Athenians yet again had an opportunity for an aggressive response. They quickly sent an army led by Cleon of over 30 ships, 1,200 hoplites, and 300 cavalry to recover Amphipolis. But after a protracted effort to retake the city, and despite mortally injuring Brasidas, Cleon and his army were massacred by the superior Spartan force. It was a devastating loss to the Athenians. After losing Cleon, the Athenians lost hope in their offensive policy and grew pessimistic that the war could be resolved either quickly or in their favor. Their treasury was nearly depleted, and the disaster at Amphipolis topped a growing list of defeats. The prospect of peace quickly gained attraction in the assembly. In 421, Nicias and the Athenians leveraged their Spartan hostages to contrive an uneasy truce with the Spartans, bringing the first phase of the war to a close, and ushering in the second phase of the war, the Peace of Nicias. While the Peace of Nicias was sworn for 50 years, it hardly lasted for 6, and was immediately plagued by small skirmishes and geopolitical maneuvering between both parties. Before long, the facade of peace was unraveling, and both sides were preparing for an inevitable return to war. In 420 BCE, the Spartans formed a pact with Boeotia, the latest in a series of moves the infuriated Athenians perceived as counter to the spirit of the peace treaty. But instead of urging Sparta to keep the peace, a new war faction in the assembly was urging the Athenians to seek their own counter-alliances. Spearheading this new war faction was the infamous Alcibiades, son of Cleinias, an ambitious young general looking to shake up Athenian foreign policy. A charioteer in the Olympic Games, a renowned orator, and a student of Socrates, Alcibiades was larger than life and quickly garnered as many supporters as enemies in Athens. Most importantly, he was the ward of Pericles and dreamed of rising to the top of the Athenian political hierarchy through any means necessary. In his first big move, he attacked Nicias' insistence on respecting the peace, claiming that Sparta was taking advantage of Athenian passivity and building up alliances for an eventual resumption of war. He insisted Athens form its own alliances with Spartan enemies. The prime candidate, he argued, was that old enemy of Sparta, Argos. After Sparta denied the Athenians' request to dissolve their alliance with Boeotia, the Athenians flew into a fury, took Alcibiades' advice, and immediately formed a defensive alliance with Argos, along with two powerful democratic states in the Peloponnese, Mantinea and Elis. The charismatic general, it seemed, was spearheading an aggressive new policy counter to the spirit of the Peace of Nicias. Strategic defeat was staring Sparta in the face if it continued to allow Athens to form alliances with Peloponnesian states so close to home. The very integrity of the Peloponnesian League, and Sparta's leadership within it, would be dangerously undermined. The Spartans were desperate to make a move. In 418, they got that opportunity in the decisive battle at Mantinea. Responding to Argos' attempted capture of Tegea, a city close to Sparta, the son of late Archidamus, King Aegeus II, quickly assembled a vast army of Spartans and marched to Mantinea to face the combined armies of Argos, Athens, Mantinea, and Arcadia. Early in the battle, the elite Argive thousand helped the Argive alliance score early successes, but they ultimately failed to capitalize on them. And in a desperate counterattack, King Aegeus was able to maneuver his disciplined Spartan hoplites and blow through the enemy, achieving an important tactical success. While the Spartans allowed the Argive Thousand and the Athenians to retreat virtually unharmed, the Spartans had won a complete victory and saved themselves from an impending defeat against Athens. Weakened, Argos and Mantinea capitulated to the Spartan demand for a dissolution of the democratic alliance with Athens. Spartan supremacy over the Peloponnese had returned. But they weren't entirely safe yet. The Athenians still had Pylos, and Alcibiades' aggressive policy remained influential in the Athenian assembly. Sparta had averted a disaster, but they had no plan to launch an effective counteroffensive. All they could hope for was a maintenance of the status quo, or a horrible Athenian blunder to capitalize on. History is littered with infamous military disasters. The British attempt to seize the Dardanelles, or Hitler's failed invasion of Russia come to mind. But in the ancient world, no venture was as disastrous as the failed Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415. No single event would turn the tides of an empire's fate so suddenly and so unnecessarily. A true turning point in the war, the disaster inflicted terrible losses in ships, men, and money, triggered rebellions across the Athenian Empire, and ultimately convinced the Persian Empire to enter the war on Sparta's side to seal the fate of Athens. How such a disaster unfolded comes down to the competing forces within the Athenian assembly, led by Nicias and his persistent rival, Alcibiades. In 416, two Greek cities in Sicily, Segesta and Leontini, sent a request for Athenian aid against a powerful state on the rise, Syracuse, claiming that if the Syracusans should take full control of Sicily, they would inevitably form a powerful anti-Athenian threat with their Dorian brethren, the Spartans. Allured by the prospect of ruling the island and confident that Syracuse posed an easy military challenge, Athens felt obliged to assist their allies in Sicily. In the ensuing debate in the assembly, the ambitious Alcibiades painted a fanciful picture of Athenian glory. With only a small fleet of 60 ships, Alcibiades could make the long trek to Syracuse and quickly subjugate the Syracusan threat and raise a new frontier for the empire. At this point, the Athenians agreed that there was minor risk in sending 60 ships and much to gain. However, when the assembly reconvened a few days later to rediscuss Segesta's request, Nicias led the debate, seeking a complete abandonment of the quest, which he found to be too risky. Do not think of running risks with a country placed so critically, or of grasping at another empire before we have secured the one we have already. He accused Alcibiades of being dangerously reckless and naive, concerned with his personal aggrandizement, but Alcibiades proudly defended himself. Athenians, I have a better right to command than others. I must begin with this, as Nicias has attacked me, and at the same time I believe myself to be worthy of it, having united the most powerful states of the Peloponnese without great danger or expense to you. I compelled the Lacedaemonians to stake their all upon the issue of a single day at Mantinea, and although victorious in the battle, they have never since fully recovered confidence. He then presented the Athenian Empire as a system built on honoring alliances. Segesta and Leontini are our confederates, and we are bound to assist them, without objecting that they have not assisted us. It is thus that empire has been won, both by us and by all others that have held it, by a constant readiness to support all, whether barbarians or Hellenes, that invite assistance. His rhetorical flourish was powerful, and he expertly appealed to the core of Athenian pride, their empire. It was here that Nicias committed a critical miscalculation. Seeing that Alcibiades' oration made the assembly more eager for the expedition, he resorted to greatly exaggerate the size of the force necessary for the expedition, hoping to convince the assembly that such a commitment would be ridiculous. But the assembly did not make this realization. They simply interpreted Nicias' remark as a reason to send more men to Sicily. When forced to give a specific estimation, Nicias hesitantly replied that the Athenians would need over 100 triremes, 5,000 hoplites, and countless more troops. Instead of reconsidering such an expedition, the Athenians embraced his recommendation. Nicias's trick had backfired. In trying to dissuade the Athenians from embarking on this risky campaign, he inadvertently turned a small expedition of 60 ships into a massive venture that was hastily planned and risky. The Athenians, blinded by desperate hopes of glorifying their empire and shifting the momentum against Sparta, were eager for the campaign to start. But the campaign would not begin without controversy. In June of 415, days before the expedition, the Athenians awoke to Hermes statues vandalized across the city, a serious omen that the superstitious Athenians took incredibly seriously. It was almost certainly a political move, an attempt to prevent the campaign from happening, and a convenient opportunity to frame Alcibiades, who was known for his unruly antics, as the perpetrator. While Alcibiades rejected the accusations, he would flee to Sparta early in the expedition out of fear of standing trial in Athens, leaving Nicias, the man most against the campaign, in charge of leading it. The Athenians hurt their campaign before it even started. It seemed that every attempt to stifle it only made things worse. In late June of 415, the expedition finally set forth to Sicily. The massive Athenian force was so large and decorated that Thucydides described it as by far the most costly and splendid Hellenic force that had ever been sent out by a single city up to that time, more a display of power and resources than an armament against an enemy. In the early campaign, the Athenians focused on gaining allies in Sicily and prepared for an attack on Syracuse. But Nicias, pessimistic the Athenians could win in Sicily and fearing defeat, procrastinated the attack for the rest of the campaigning season, giving the Syracusans time to shake off their initial shock. Led by the best Syracusan general, Hermocrates, the city quickly implemented a series of major military reforms, growing the size of their army and streamlining the chains of command to give the generals more direct control of their men. They built stronger walls around their city and, most importantly, sent requests to both Corinth and Sparta to openly make war with Athens for clearly breaking the peace. Corinth enthusiastically responded with men of their own, while Sparta, having been begged by a desperately vengeful Alcibiades to attack Athens, sent a small expedition under the general Gylippus. In 414, Nicias felt forced to make a move, and decided to besiege Syracuse, hoping to either starve it out or take it by treason from within. And with control of the sea, the Athenians were confident they could intercept any Spartan assistance. The plan was extremely effective early on, and the Syracusans soon entered discussions over the terms of their surrender. But Nicias was pleased with his success and grew overconfident, thinking a resolution of the siege was not pressing and that the Athenians could force more favorable terms of surrender if they continued their siege. They were making progress, he reasoned, and help was far off. Once again, Nicias made a disastrous miscalculation. An army of over 3,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry under Gylippus was sailing to spoil his party. When Gylippus did finally arrive, he quickly accumulated victories, slaughtering forces of Athenians at various forts and building counter walls to counter Nicias' siege. Realizing his mistake, Nicias abandoned all hopes of conquering the city and sent a request to the Athenian assembly to abort the campaign. But the allure of such a close strategic victory clouded the assembly's judgment, and they instead sent Demosthenes with reinforcements to continue the siege. Poor Nicias had committed the same error that led to the campaign in the first place. It's easy to explain why Athens insisted on continuing the campaign. The Athenians held their great leader and general in the highest regard. Syracuse was a weak enemy, and Athens' might could only be resisted for so long. Underestimating small states has plagued countless powerful states before, and the Athenians were no exception. Gylippus and the Syracusans would soon punish the Athenians for their overconfidence. Between 414 and 413, a string of battles ended horribly for the Athenians, but none were as disastrous as their attempted attack on Epipolae, in which Demosthenes, who had come with reinforcements, planned a bold night attack on the Syracusan counterwall. With a massive army of 10,000 hoplites, he marched under the moonlight and launched a surprise attack. The Athenians began to charge the enemy, but the darkness caused the battle to erupt into chaos. The Athenians quickly lost track of who was who, and began slaughtering each other. The Syracusans' shouts, cheers, and war chants only added to the terror of the frenzy. Thucydides captures what happened next in the embarrassing affair. Thus, after being thrown into disorder, they ended up coming into collision with each other in many parts of the field, friends with friends, and citizens with citizens, and not only terrified one another, but even came to blows and could only be parted with difficulty. In the pursuit, many perished by throwing themselves down the cliffs, the way down from Epipolae being narrow, and of those who got down safely into the plain, most were cut off in the morning by the Syracusan cavalry and killed. The slaughter was the worst disaster of the war. The Syracusans killed over 2,000 Athenian hoplites, and all hopes of a victory were dashed. But now, Nicias was terrified to abandon the campaign out of fear that the assembly would blame him for the failure and punish him accordingly. Hesitancy and fear paralyzed the general, and Gylippus quickly exploited Nicias' indecision. In a series of brilliant naval attacks, Gylippus and the Syracusans destroyed the last vestiges of the Athenian expedition and captured both Demosthenes and Nicias. After a quick vote, though against the wishes of Gylippus, the Syracusans executed both generals. The Sicilian campaign was over. Mistakes and misfortune at every turn had made what would have been a minimal expedition into a disastrous turning point that ultimately sealed the fate of Athens. When news finally reached Athens by way of the few soldiers that did return home, nobody would believe them. The consequences of the Sicilian disaster quickly manifested. Emboldened states across the empire rebelled, and Athenian democracy faced extinction due to political revolt within the city. But surprisingly, Athens held on. Both the Athenians and the Spartans knew that the Athenian navy was still superior at sea, and Athens' long walls were a final but impossible obstacle to overcome. Only a single power could turn the tide: the Persians. With their help, the Spartans could acquire the military and financial assistance to finally seal the deal on Athens. Thus, the third phase of the war, the Ionian War, saw both Sparta and Athens endeavor to woo the great king of the East. The fate of the war, it seemed, rested on the decisions of an empire that was the sworn enemy of a united Greece only decades ago. After years of geopolitical maneuvering, the Spartans were able to convince Darius II, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, of Athens' strategic threat in the Aegean. After an impressive 7-year stand, the Athenians finally met their fate in a naval battle at Aegospotami in 405. The brilliant Spartan general, Lysander, supported by Prince Cyrus the Younger, son of Darius II, managed to destroy the remnants of the Athenians' war effort by destroying 168 of their ships and capturing over 3,000 Athenian soldiers. With the prospect of a lengthy siege unbearable, the Athenians surrendered to Lysander and the Spartans in 404 BCE. The Peloponnesian War was over. While Sparta technically won the war, they hardly reaped the spoils of victory. Athens quickly deposed Sparta's puppet oligarchs in Athens, and would regain an important, albeit diminished, political role in Greek affairs. And Sparta's control over Greece remained weak, and ultimately ended for good after their defeat against Thebes in 371 BCE. The truth is, the war produced no victors. It spelled the end of the Greek Golden Age, ushered in new levels of violence into the Greek psyche, and ultimately paved the way for a new power, Philip II and Alexander's Macedon, to subdue the wearied Greek world en route to empire. The violent battles, disastrous miscalculations, and mass murders throughout the war give us a painful vignette into the levels of inhumanity we can stoop to. Thucydides himself captures the sentiment with a somber reflection. War takes away the easy supply of daily wants, and so proves a rough master that brings most men's characters to a level with their fortunes. War is tragic, and in that tragedy are lessons.